Hello everybody and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program Beyond Horizons. We are just returning the tourists from Tavern 2, have just spent a few weeks up there, and on the way back down, one of the RCS ports blows up. Hopefully none of the tourists saw that because they might ask for their money back. I imagine it's not too reassuring when the plane is already on fire and you look out your window and see one of the pieces of the plane melting off. Probably make you a bit worried about how safe the plane actually is. But we make it through the rigors of re-entry relatively unscathed. I mean, nobody died, so that's the main thing. And now we are just returning to the runway. Now we're not landing at the Space Center, we're actually landing at Nye Island, which is one of the additional runways added by the Kerbal side mod. It's not technically updated for the latest release of Kerbal Space Program, but it doesn't seem to have any problems running, so it's just nice to use a couple of different runways. It provides new scenery and a bit more intrigue, I think. I was a little bit worried about this return. As you can see, I've got about 1,000 meters per second of delta V left, which for an air-breathing engine is not very much, and so I was a bit worried that we might just miss the runway and have to put it in the ocean, which again I think might induce a refund, which we're not giving them. So here we are on approach. I had a terrible approach here. You can see I'm way off my bearing, but I managed to straighten up at the last minute. And I give them a very Ryanair touchdown on the runway, so hopefully nobody asks for any kind of refunds. They're Kerbals, they wouldn't do that anyway. They got to go to space and I think they're happy with that. But yeah, the Bismuth proving to be a very reliable piece of our tourist infrastructure. Now, I've already had quite a few failures of space planes in this playthrough, but none quite as bad as this one. This is, or rather was supposed to be, the SSTO Titan, my heavy lifter space plane. And the rain there is a bad omen for what's to come. The main issue that this space plane had was the four engines sticking out the back of the main fuselage there. Because of the payload that this space plane had, the center of mass is quite far forward, which means that the landing gear also need to be quite far forward for it to take off effectively. And those engines stick out way behind the backwards landing gear, so I did try and give it some little ones just to stop it scraping on the runway, but as you can see, it literally just prevented it from taking off in the first place. One of the other big issues this plane had was a little more out of my control, so the larger landing gears and the extra large landing gears are a bit glitchy in Kerbal Space Program and tend to have a few Kraken-y sort of properties. With this SSTO and other space planes that I've designed, sometimes it would just twist on the runway. Let's just start turning to the left for no reason at all, like some phantom yaw. And I sometimes could fix this problem by adding more landing gear or changing some of the suspension settings, but sometimes literally nothing could be done about it, and this obviously makes it harder to take off because I'm no longer lined up with the runway. Even though on paper it had all the thrust and delta V it needed to get into orbit, it couldn't even get off the runway. This project then was pretty quickly scrapped, and that was annoying because, as you might catch a glimpse of here, there is actually a payload that I'm trying to get into orbit with this. And I was pretty determined to get it into orbit with an SSTO, and I kind of had a bit of a brainwave and decided to approach the problem a completely different way. So let's talk about the payload before we can get onto the main topic. So here we have two probes destined for Dres. One is called Echo, which is basically just a communication satellite to sit in orbit, and one is called Dust, which will land on the surface and collect some scientific data. And you know, Dres isn't a very interesting place to visit, it's basically just the moon, but further away, so I didn't think it was necessary to send a big, complicated mission, just a couple of probes. But yeah, to get it into orbit, I used the Hermes, which is my vertical single stage to orbit cargo vessel. You know, there's definitely a lot of hype in the Kerbal Space Program community with space planes, and for good reason, they are very, very cool, but of course single stage to orbit vessels do not have to be planes. And so that's what I've done here. We have a vertical single stage to orbit vessel, and it's basically just a big fuel tank with some big rockets and a big cargo bay, and let me tell you, it works very, very well. Since its design, I have pretty much launched everything I need to using it, because it just is incredibly versatile, and let's be honest, it looks pretty darn cool. So it utilizes 9 of the vector engines, the ones that are inspired by the space shuttle, mainly because they have an insane amount of thrust and are pretty fuel efficient, all things considered. And it's rated to carry about 100 tons of payload into low Kerbin orbit, and just for reference, that's just under 3 of the big orange fuel tanks. And that wouldn't even fit in the cargo bay, so pretty much anything that I can fit in the cargo bay I can get into low Kerbin orbit with a lot of ease. And after a few runs with this thing, I've sat down and worked out the cost of running it. It comes to about 50,000 units, which is generally cheaper than most expendable launches that I would build for pretty much any mission. So it is reusable and entirely cost effective. Yes, the whole thing comes back down. You can probably see in the staging there, it's got a load of parachutes. Those are tucked away in a little fairing at the top. That is the only bit that is expended during a flight of this ship. But I reckon those are extremely cheap anyway, so it's not a big deal. Literally the only drawback of this vessel is that anything I want to launch with it must fit inside the cargo bay. It's using the Mark III spaceplane cargo bays, so it usually can hold pretty much everything I want to launch, but I've had a few things where I've had to slightly adjust the size of some of the payloads just so that it will fit in the cargo bay and also be able to get out as well, because that's quite important. But generally, I've had absolutely no problems with flying this thing, and a bit later on I'll actually show you one of the test landings where, even though something went wrong, it still performed remarkably well. Here we are using it to launch yet another interplanetary probe. This one is basically exactly the same as the one destined for Dres, just without the lander. This one is going to Moho. And Moho is a very difficult target to get to because it is so close to the sun. Which means you need quite a lot of delta V just to get down to that sort of altitude above the sun, but also it is quite an inclined orbit that you're trying to reach, and that also requires a lot of delta V. So yeah, I didn't bring a lander just to save on fuel, and I thought I might as well just do that another time when we've got a bit more technology to make it a bit easier. The transfer window for both Dres and Moho are over a week away in game time, so we'll check back in with these when it is time for them to depart. In the meantime, we need to fly the Hermes back, and I also use the Hermes to launch Ayla 6, which is taking crew to the surface base that we have on Minmus, but I completely forgot to record the launch of that, so we will check in with that flight very shortly. But here we are, just making our deorbiting maneuver so we can come back near the Space Center. Now, generally the idea with this launch vehicle is to land it back in the ocean to the east of the launch site, but as you saw in the first launch there, I actually undershot a little bit, which is not like me. Normally I completely overshoot, but we still even managed to land it on the ground. I was a bit worried about breaking the engines, but with all the parachutes and the little bit of fuel that was left in the tanks, we managed to set it down very gently without breaking anything. It's taken me a few flights of this vessel to practice getting the landing right. Here I am, in more typical fashion, overshooting the space center quite a bit. You'll see it starts to oscillate here. I'm not doing that. It starts doing that by itself. I suspect that is because we have the fins on the bottom of the rocket there, which makes it want to go nose first into the atmosphere, but then we've also got the air brakes on the top, which makes it want to go rear first into the atmosphere, and I think this oscillation is kind of the effect of those two forces playing on the rocket. But this turns out to be a feature, not a bug. As you might have seen there, we were getting some overheating warnings on the engines as we were re-entering the atmosphere. And so this rotation actually helps distribute the heat across all of the engines so that no single engine gets too much of it and explodes. I think if I want to improve on this rocket, I will try and make it land at the Space Center, similar to like the SpaceX boosters. The only thing is I don't really have landing gear large enough to support this whole rocket. I know there are mods that have landing gears that big, but I won't be able to color them right, and it won't fit the theme of the rocket, so we'll have to figure out how to tackle that problem. But for now, we just land this in the ocean. In the first iteration of this rocket, which I will show you in just a moment, I was worried about this toppling over in the ocean. I thought, since it's so large, toppling over might actually break something, so I came up with what I thought was a pretty ingenious solution to solve that, but as you just saw there, it wasn't a problem that needed solving anyway. But yeah, the first few flights of the Hermes have proven to be a complete success, and it will now take over as our cargo SSTO for pretty much all missions destined for low Kerb in orbit. So here is the first test flight of the Hermes. Now you'll see up in the parachute section there, I've got a little fuel tank with a tiny little engine. The idea was to use that engine to kind of cushion the fall as this thing topples over in the ocean. But I didn't really get to test that, and I'll let you listen to why. Yes, that frantic clicking is me trying to push the spacebar and get the parachutes to deploy, but they are not deploying, so I start deploying them by hand, and even accidentally cut one of the actually deployed parachutes. And I realised I'm not going to have enough time to deploy them all, and I wasn't really sure how I was going to rescue this. I was trying very hard to not take that thunder as a bad omen. I realised that this thing does have fuel left, so I was like, we're going to have to do a powered descent. You can see actually the engine up in the parachute section there is firing as well, but it's so weak it doesn't affect the heading of the rocket at all. So with only one parachute and a figurative drop of fuel left, I try my hardest to land this in the ocean, and well, I do just that, and it's absolutely fine. I didn't even think about using the rocket to cushion the fall. I was just more happy that this thing didn't crash into the ocean at 100 meters per second. But yeah, look at that. Even when everything goes drastically wrong, this rocket still proves to be very reliable. And we will certainly get a lot more use out of this rocket before it ever needs replacing. I mentioned earlier that we used the Hermes to launch this ALS 6 to get some crew up into our surface base on Minmus. Unfortunately, I did forget to record the launch of that. I do apologise, but here we are just making our mid-course corrections so that we get into a nice orbit around Minmus. This mission to the icy surface of Minmus is headed by Megan and Seapond Kerman, which if you've been watching the series for a while, you might remember they were stationed on Beluga for quite a while and made many lunar landings. Thus they were deemed the most experienced Kerbals that we could send on this mission. But before they arrive at Minmus, we first have to set off with Dust and Echo on their way to Dres. So our departure burn doesn't quite get us to Dres because Dres is on quite an inclined orbit, so we have to make a mid-course correction to adjust our inclination so that we actually encounter Dres. And then we'll make one final correction when we're closer to the dwarf planet so that we can put ourselves in, I think I'll put myself in a polar orbit because that'll be better for the communication satellite, and plus that gives us a nice range of biomes available to us for the lander. But our first course correction isn't for 100 days or so, so we will check back in with this probe in another episode. To finish up today's episode, we're coming back to our Moho probe, which is called Echo 2, and we are just making our transfer burn to Moho. Now, I had a couple of problems. As you can see there, Moho is really inclined, and so I made my exit burn kind of assuming that I wouldn't get an encounter right away, and I'd have to make a mid-course correction. Which I guess turned out to be sort of true, but I didn't even get close to Moho, and I'm not sure whether that's because maybe the alarm clock was a little bit wrong about the transfer window, or whether I just made a bad, burn to it. But as you'll see, the trajectory for this probe is not very close to Moho at all, but luckily it's got loads of delta V, so what I suspect I'll end up having to do is do a few flybys first, just to try and reduce my velocity. So that we can actually get into orbit, because that is the biggest problem with getting to Moho. Forget about the inclination change or even just the transfer burn to begin with. When you come down to Moho, you're coming up from Kerbal orbit around the sun, which is significantly higher to where you're going, so you have loads of time to pick up lots and lots of speed that you then have to cancel out when you arrive at Moho. I remember a few years ago I did a playthrough, and I tried to send a crewed mission to Moho, and I hadn't really done that properly before, and I had completely underestimated the amount of fuel that I needed. So I stranded them, and so what I ended up doing to rescue the crew is I managed to get them to Eve orbit, and from Eve I sent a whole mining rig to go and get ore from the surface of Gilly, convert that into fuel, refuel the craft that the astronauts were stuck in, and then come home. And that was a massive operation, and I'm really sad I never recorded any of it, because it was actually it was quite impressive, actually, the lengths I went to rescue those astronauts. And while I hope that doesn't happen to any of my crewed missions on this playthrough, I do think that a lot of the fun of Kerbal Space Program comes from making huge mistakes and then having to fix them somehow. I think a lot of the excitement of this game comes from having to solve problems creatively. Especially the problems you create yourself. Now here you'll see I do manage to pull an encounter with Moho eventually. It's not really ideal. I think we'll still be going quite fast when we encounter the planet there. So what I suspect will happen is we'll do a flyby there, make a maneuver around the planet, and then on another encounter, maybe then we can get into orbit. Like I said, this has plenty of fuel, so we should be able to do that. But that course correction isn't for a few months away, so we'll check back in a while with this one. In any case, that's all I have for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to catch up with older episodes, you can check out the playlist that this video is in. But I've been Moonfish1001, and I'll see you in the next video.